Tonight, we have Peter Mancuso to lead us in a discussion of William J. Ryczek, Bill to all of us, When Johnny Comes Sliding Home, the story of baseball in the late Civil War period and that interim period before the National Association comes forward. Many of you have never heard of Peter Mancuso before, but he's a ne'er-do-well from Staten Island, but seems to be a personable enough guy. He has been a member of SABR for about 25 years, I believe, and became chairman of this committee in 2007, I believe, when he made a big mistake and called me to do the newsletter, and he's had regretted it ever since. But nevertheless, he has done numerous articles in numerous different places about 19th century baseball in Staten Island, in New York, and around all those. And we'll just let Peter get started here, and let's see how Johnny came sliding home.
Thank you very much, Bob. I live in New Hope, Pennsylvania. Almost as long as I lived in Staten Island, not quite. Anyway, so this evening's book is pretty much a baseball classic in a way. Bill Ryczek, I call it his 19th century trilogy. It's When Johnny Came Sliding Home, which is the book we're going to discuss tonight. It was his second of three books that he actually wrote in reverse chronological order. He wrote first a book called Blackguards and Red Stockings, which is about the formation and the 5 years of existence of the National Association of Professional Baseball Players. We call it the NA. And he published that in 1992. Then he went backwards to the decade prior to the National Association, which was the 1860s. And that's what When Johnny Comes Sliding Home was all about. And then finally, his last book wasn't published until 2009, and it's called Baseball's First Innings. And I've read all three books over the period of time here. And I remember when I first read, and I was rereading When Johnny Came Sliding Home, I was having a deja vu of, oh yeah, I remember this. And I was like, this was such a frustrating era. And it's filled with little nuances and problems, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. When you look at Bill's book, you'll notice that he has a bibliography that only includes 4 newspapers. And you kind of wonder, wow, only 4 newspapers. But one of those includes the Chadwick scrapbooks. He also has 20 baseball books that he looked at, and 7 other non-baseball histories, and about 20 articles. But that generated, in the 26 chapters of his book, that generated over almost 1,000 citations. So what does that tell you about when he wrote this book immediately? Anyone? What wasn't there?
Well, there wasn't that none much. Of this, yeah, no databases or anything.
That's right. Yeah. There is no real internet at the time when he wrote this. And he really had to, dig out what he could. And he did a really amazing job at it. And to consider that without the access that we have today of the internet, of him having 1,000 citations across those 26 chapters, is pretty amazing. So he does include an acknowledgement section. There's a few names that pop out in there and say, oh, wow, yeah, Tom Schreiber, and Frederick Iver Campbell, and some others. Uh, one of the things that I found to be pretty interesting is that Bill, in his preface, immediately states that this book is not in chronological order. That he's gonna, yes, there is a general pattern of him working through the decade in chronological order, but once in a while he'll depart from that, and he will just speak about a certain aspect of baseball, like black baseball and other issues. So he doesn't write a strictly chronological presentation here, and it kind of keeps it flowing, and it's pretty interesting. So let's start with 1860, and I'm going to try to stay a little bit chronological here. But in 1860, we have how long has the National Association of Baseball Players been in existence at that point? Does anybody remember?
It's 30.
Okay, so they only existed a couple of years. 1858
yeah.
was the formation of the National Association of Baseball Players. It took place 1 year after Doc Adams' 1857 rules, because he was chairing a rules committee, and it was essentially very much affected by the Knickerbocker model. And that's how it starts off. So the first season that the book covers the ground on is that in 1860, if anybody remembers, how many clubs joined the National Association? Because baseball is really rolling now.
Yeah.
There was over 100, weren't there?
Yeah, 62 actually.
62,
so
yeah.
So you got to realize that in only 2 years since the formation of the National Association, there's already 62 clubs in 1860 that joined the National Association. And Larry had asked a question of John Popovich just this morning about what might be the origins or some of the history of baseball equipment, because he has some interest in that, of course, a proto ball. And what's interesting is what immediately I observed was that John goes back, what he finds at least as possibly the oldest advertising of baseball equipment occurs in 1857 and 1858. So it was when the rules are created, and that this growth is very, very rapid, to come up to 62 teams, most of them in the New York area. So very, very quickly, what's approaching the country in 1860?
War.
Civil War, yeah.
Civil War, right?
Yeah.
And it's a very dramatic. Lincoln is elected in November of 1860. Almost immediately, there's even before he's elected, there was talk of secession and the splitting of the nation and states peeling off from the Union. And of course, he's sworn in March, and by April, Fort Sumner in South Carolina is fired upon by South Carolina forces. So the war begins within weeks of Lincoln's being sworn in. But there was a kind of threat in the air that this was going to happen. And by December of 1861, and what happens every December, by the way, or thereabouts, November, December, in our baseball world?
The winter meeting convention.
Yeah, it's like a winter meeting.
Yeah,
right?
winter meeting, right.
So by 1861, when the war has begun, it's already happening. There's only 34 teams in the National Association of Baseball Players, and it will continue to go down during the war. And that's, a kind of revelation and a real clear pattern that happens through that 1860s. When we're talking about a decade of baseball evolution, we're actually, you can almost say that you're talking about less than a decade, because baseball almost ceases to evolve. A couple of things do happen. We'll talk about that in a minute. But baseball almost ceases to evolve during the Civil War. So for that 4-year period, 5-year period, there's almost no growth in baseball whatsoever. Bill then jumps to a point about, so there's certain things when you're reading Bill's book, you have to kind of understand that certain things have not been resolved yet. He's writing this book nearly 30 years ago, and having it published nearly 30 years ago, you begin to say, oh yeah, well, that's right. That's what was believed to be the truth 30 years ago. So 30 years ago, who invented baseball?
The Cartwright.
That was on the
Cartwright. Sorry, who was it, Jerry?
Cartwright.
Cartwright, yeah.
That's right. He gets into talking a lot about Alexander Cartwright. And of course, that movement began in the 1940s with Henderson's book, Ball, Bat, and Bishop, where he talks about, the development of ball play. And he mentions, Bill mentions baseball, Ball, Bat, and Bishop as one of his sources. And Cartwright is mentioned in that book. And of course, by the time Bill is writing this book in the 1998, for publication in 1998, Cartwright is still the person who is believed to have been, in the Knickerbockers very, very strongly, and Cartwright particularly had believed to be like the Johnny Appleseed of baseball. And, I think everybody bought into that until there was other revelations about it. And it's still a decade in front of David Block's book. So when David Block starts talking about, well, wait a minute, there's actually baseball before there's rounders, not the other way around. Yeah, he gives us that revelation. But of course, in the 1990s, when Bill's writing this book, he doesn't know that yet. He talks a little bit about Creighton. So what is really Creighton's legacy to the game? What does he really do?
Well, he was a cheater, more than anything else.
He's a cheater. Okay.
Cheater, yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
He died young.
Yeah.
We still do have cheating once in a while in baseball, right? And football. But what's kind of interesting is that probably Creighton's legacy, he is a cheater. He's snapping. I mean, obviously he's snapping his wrists, and somehow, and he's kind of being able to speed up the ball.
Well,
he's practicing.
Can I say something, Peter? When you ask it, let me say something real quick. I took it, his legacy. Yeah, it was a cheater, but he also, from Bill's book, it kind of, and this is what I liked about Bill's book. He kind of mentioned Creighton, but in comparison to the gentlemanly behavior of the other teams. And I kind of picked that up. There was the Excelsiors, the Atlantics, they were all these gentlemen. And then there was, in that chapter, then they talked about Bill Creighton too. And so I kind of took that as, as an emphasis of one side versus the whole, the ruffians and the not so good people on the other side.
The way I've always thought of Creighton, and you're going to have to forgive me, I really only wrote recently in the last maybe 5 years, started reading 1860s history about this when I started playing vintage, but I always thought he was a first superstar. To me, it just seemed like he just had a superstar mentality, the way that he was always portrayed and he was talked about. I know a little bit in baseball how it happened. He talked about, the professionalism and how he had these cushy jobs and how they were reserved for him, this sort of thing. I know he talks about it here in this book as well, but I always thought he just perceived me as a superstar. Whether he was, whether he wasn't, that's how I always saw him.
And I saw it also that he died young. And so that transformed. I mean, anybody who lived through the 60s, people who might have just faded out over time. If they died young, they were then emblazoned and became heroes or rock stars or whatever.
Martyred. They were martyred.
Yes.
And wait a minute, I apologize. I think I was confusing Crater with Bill Craven or Bill Craver, the other guy.
Oh, Craver. We'll get to him.
Yeah, Bill Craver. So I'm sorry about that. I was thinking about him. Yeah.
Yeah. Creighton is, and I agree with both of you, of course, is that Creighton is perceived as a superstar.
Superstar, right.
Probably largely because of his early death. That was the icing on the cake, no doubt. And his legacy, as Bill points out, really has to do with changing the disposition of the game from something social to something very, very competitive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're starting to see competition creep into the game with these what they call the championship series and so forth and so on. But Creighton really went from the job of a pitcher, putting the ball into play, lobbing it in so that somebody could hit it. And, that was the game. That was the excitement of the game. But Creighton did something very, very different. And he saw himself as somebody who was capable of foiling batters and stifling their ability to hit. And that is really, I think what Bill points out is that that's the legacy. That's his true legacy. That he did change the game in that regard, and because of his stature his stature as a hero, he's remembered for that, in a positive way. By 1864, the Union is beginning to see signs that they're going to be victorious. And by 1864, there's already a kind of excitement brewing that baseball is going to return. And then in 1865, what do we experience besides the return of baseball? But what greatly helped it along? It's a very kind of
the soldiers returned home.
The what?
Soldiers returned home.
Yes, the soldiers are coming home.
The economy is improving.
I'm sorry, what else?
Well, the economy is improving. He gets into that.
That's exactly right. And Bill points that out, that actually the economy between 1865, the conclusion of the Civil War, it starts to become a boom economy. And it remains a boom economy until what?
1873.
1873, the Panic of 1873. So for that stretch, there's no downturn. There's no we don't have 8% mortgages or that type of thing happening. It is a true boom economy, and it lasts all the way to 1873. There's no downturn. So it's kind of interesting that baseball is given that extra boost of going along with it. So, although there's more and more clubs by this point joining the National Association, how are the powers to be? What do they see as the core of the National Association of Baseball Players? What teams do they see as its core?
New York.
New York for sure. Brooklyn.
New York and Brooklyn.
Excelsior, the Atlantics.
Morrisania, Irvington, out in North Jersey, and one other team.
You start to see the rise of the Athletics out of Philadelphia.
Oh, yeah, right.
Exactly. The Athletics out of Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And, I mean, these are the serious teams. These are the teams that they consider to be the drivers of professional baseball. No, I'm sorry. I shouldn't say that. They're the drivers of baseball. Nobody's a professional yet. Right?
Brighton, maybe.
Well, he's dead.
Right. There are some other teams out. There are some other teams out there. There's teams in Boston that are playing the New York game by this time. There's also teams in Baltimore and DC. But how about the South? How about the far South?
Not really.
Almost none.
Yeah, there were some teams in New Orleans. Occasionally, you hear about Charleston. They tend to be port cities where the ships would come in, and the game might spread a little bit if some of them stayed around.
Yeah, there's a smattering of baseball in the South, but it doesn't have like anywhere near what's happening in the Northeast. And also, the one exception perhaps is New Orleans. That has had like a particular baseball experience leading up to the Civil War, and then it picked up again after the Civil War.
Well, the rest of the South had a difficult economy compared to the North, too. I mean, during that period, they were still recovering.
Right. Yeah, the South was in the process of rebuilding. They had a lot of infrastructure damage, where in the North, there was virtually no infrastructure damage. And, the railroads, of course, were key to baseball at that time.
Do you think, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Do you think that was, he mentions it briefly, but he doesn't really go into, do you think it's very much the South was still very anti-union, that it's a New York game, it's a union game. Yes, the soldiers on both sides played in the Civil War, but to embrace that was to embrace the Union. Do you think that played in the psyche, played a big role?
Well, there was a lack of trust on the part of the South to Northerners coming in. So that was clearly a piece of it.
I'm thinking even deeper, just more of almost like, the original mythos was, we don't want, baseball, we don't want it to be descended from rounders because we don't want anything to do with the British. I'm wondering if the South had that same mentality. Even though there were Northerners and carpetbaggers that came down there, we don't want anything Northern. We don't want anything from the Union. We don't want anything of you, including your game. I'm just curious what you guys think of that.
Yeah. Who becomes one of the biggest champions for baseball being a reuniter? But he's a very powerful baseball person. Who is it?
Chadwick?
Chadwick, yeah.
I'm sorry,
Chadwick?
Who? Chadwick.
Chadwick, yeah.
Yeah. Bill mentions Chadwick's role. Chadwick's mother, I believe, was from the South. Of course, he's from England, but his mother was a Southern lady who went to England and was married there, and then they migrated back to the United States. But it's kind of interesting that Chadwick, he's so anxious to have the country reunited that he considers one of the cities that we don't really consider a southern city. He considers it a southern city. And what was that?
Washington, D.C.
Yeah, Washington.
Yeah,
wasn't there Memphis too?
Well,
Memphis was later.
Yeah, he considers D.C., Washington, D.C. to be a southern city, which is really, it isn't by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, especially baseball-wise. We'll get into that in a second.
There was an article or some writing about Richmond, Virginia, not wanting to play teams from Washington because they saw them as federal and the North. And I'm trying to remember, it was that doctor from the Atlantics who had moved down there was still kind of the eminent degrees of Richmond baseball, and they would play among themselves or teams from Petersburg or something like that, but they didn't want to play Washington people. So I think that attitude was present.
Well, Richmond was also capital of the Confederacy. So they probably bought into it even more than any of the other towns, cities in the South.
Yeah. I tried to stick with a little bit. Bill Bailey mentions Richmond. And it's kind of interesting because later on, I mean, again, he's writing this book in the 90s. There's a book out called When Baseball Was White. I'm sorry, before baseball was white.
Yeah.
And a big portion of that book involves people like Babcock, who was a guy from Brooklyn who ended up to be a Confederate, and who kind of ruled over Richmond baseball after the Civil War. And he very much shunned any kind of contact, even with Washington, because Washington had some black players and they, or they played other teams who had black players and so forth and so on. So he got into that.
We have in the
sorry.
It's Mark. Hi. In the Protoball database, we actually have games. Now they're mainly from the ports. So Mobile, Alabama, Norfolk, Virginia. We have games by 1860, 1858, and a smattering of areas throughout the South. They are sparse through the war. And then, like, for instance, Richmond, I know, is 1866. That's when you see the first team in Richmond, and also as well as into the interior in Georgia and some of those other places. So there was some baseball in the South. You'll see some of them are like, regiments from New York or Massachusetts, but there was a team in Macon, I think 1860. So but yeah, it is, you do see him in those ports. And one of the things, I think it's Mobile, is Steve Bayon, who takes baseball back to Cuba and played for the Unions in Mauritania in mid 1860s and later. I believe he went to college along with several other Cubans that would send their kids to college there in the Mobile area, and they played baseball there. So
yeah,
that was Spring Hill College in Mobile.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's things that we know, now today, that Bill didn't know in the 90s, and certainly I didn't know those things in the 90s. I was just kind of getting involved in SABR. But it was a time when what's very revealing here, and what's kind of interesting, that when you look at, and Bill talks about this a little bit, when you look at baseball tours first go north, with the Excelsiors going up through New England. I mean, upstate New York, and a little bit of New England. You talk about going south, but only as far south as Baltimore and D.C. And they talk about, eventually, we'll get into that, when they go west. The Nationals are going west to play those, what we call the Midwest today, but they call the West then. Mm-hmm. But he says they didn't go south. In other words, it wasn't. They didn't see the potential in it, probably, and they maybe weren't aware of what the opportunities were, and they more or less shunned going south. So that was part of the dynamic at the time, which Bill does point out. There's a couple of things that happened in the early 1860s while the war is on that play a very kind of key role in the movement toward professional baseball. And So what do you think one of those things is? You can kind of guess here. Well, it's the idea of having enclosed grounds. And they learned a little lesson way back in 1858, 59 with the fashion race course game of how many people, I mean, they've created something very exciting, this kind of New York All-Star game with New York teams versus Brooklyn teams and Brooklyn players and New York players. And they got all this excitement. They realized that people were willing to pay. That, of course, was prior to the 1860s. But in 1861, William Cattermeyer, ends up buying a piece of property at Marcy Avenue and Rutledge Street. I know where that is, by the way. I was a Brooklyn cop. And what do you think was created there?
Union grounds.
Union grounds. The first, well, Jerry Casway of Philadelphia will give you a little different view of what was the first enclosed stadium. But Bill is in agreement with a lot of other people too that the Union grounds were the first enclosed grounds. And they were in Brooklyn. And initially they were used for ice skating, freezing the grounds in the winter and using it for ice skating, which there was a big craze at the time for ice skating. And what followed ice skating was, and baseball was baseball on skates. So that became another thing. And Cattermeyer, building a fence, was able then to charge admission to get onto the grounds. But these grounds are sitting there in the non-winter months, and he decides that, I got the fence. I should put in some seats for who?
The ladies.
The ladies. I should put in some seats for the ladies because they all want ladies at their games because they feel the kind of control, it kind of tempers the male population, especially in Brooklyn. And and it's no surprise that the second enclosed grounds are what grounds?
Capitoline.
The Capitoline grounds, also in Brooklyn, in what's Brownsville today. So those two fields, with their enclosed grounds, offer this opportunity, of course, to begin to charge admission. Now, it's kind of interesting what the public thought. The public thought that it's okay to pay the grounds, but don't pay the players because they're supposed to be amateurs.
Right.
Right. So what the deal was, as Bill points out, is that the public, yes, they paid admission to come into the field. They weren't too aware, or at least didn't want to divulge, that they understood that that money that they were given to William Cattermeyer to enter his grounds was actually going to be divided between him and the teams that played there. So that's how the teams now begin to get a steady flow of money beyond creating a job for a special player or doing something, kind of paying him under the, by club dues or whatever of other members. So very, very important to the development of baseball, professional baseball, begins with this idea that there were enclosed grounds to play at. And Bill makes that point over and over again in his book.
Peter, can I say something real quickly? Something else that Bill mentioned that I didn't know about before. The Knickerbockers didn't really want to charge because they were so mannerly, but he mentioned that the Mutuals and it was the Atlantics, they wanted to charge and they wanted to put up a fence, but their purpose was to keep all the ruffians out of there, the rowdy people. So they felt that a charge would keep the worst people out because they couldn't afford to pay it, and then they could also afford to build a fence that would keep the people out as well. He
Jack,
mentioned that a little bit.
Well,
Jack, I'm glad you
Kanemayer
brought
says,
that up. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I'm glad you brought that up. I was thinking the same thing, but I just couldn't understand why that was the prevailing thought. I'm thinking if you're a ruffian or you're a gambler or you're a pickpocket, you could certainly afford 10 cents to get in to maybe make yourself a few dollars, if not more. So that always kind of blew my mind. We're keeping the ruffians out, but I'm sure the ruffians can afford to get in for 10 cents.
Yeah, this is new for me. New when I read this,
I
Thanks,
know there
Paul.
was a team later that said the Philadelphia actually charged $1. That was insane to get in, and they only had 2,000 or 3,000 people. But yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on your statement. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, well, thanks.
Well, that dollar fee, by the way, by the Athletics in Philadelphia, was actually in response to a riot that took place there a few weeks before, and that dollar fee was a real attempt by them to limit the crowd that showed up, because 40,000 people showed up for the game where the riot occurred. And
wow,
many of them never even got near the field. They got within about a quarter mile of it. But the idea of offense initially, though, yes, there's this idea about keeping out rowdies, but the initial use of offense was for ice skating, and it was to charge admission to ice skate. So it just became a kind of natural thing that they would charge admission. Yes, they thought that also it might in some way deter ruffians and, people that didn't have a lot of money. One thing that happened, however, in this period that Bill points out is that there's never a fence put at the Elysian Fields in this era. Elysian Fields still continues to be a place, but what begins to happen is, what kind of games get played in the Elysian Fields?
Amateur.
Social games. That was the term. The Knickerbockers played, the Eagles played, and so forth. They played these very social games at the Elysian Fields. It wasn't the place. The Knickerbockers didn't travel to the Union Grounds to play in the Union Grounds. They went to the Elysian Fields and continued to play there. Another interesting thing, subtle. The term used for through 1863, or up to 1863, the term used for the team was what?
Well,
club.
Oh yeah, clubs. Yeah.
That connotates it not being a professional game. It's a club. The club is coming to the field to play. Of course, there's guys in the club that are getting some kind of a reward for playing, financial reward, one way or the other. But then you see that the terminology begins to change a little bit, slowly creeps in, and more clubs are referred to as teams. Now, during the Civil War years, we're still in that 1861 to 1865 period. Bill points out that there's two innovations, however, that do occur by committee. As small as the committees are, as small as the National Association has become at this point during the Civil War, there's still two rules that occur that do a lot to change the game. Does anybody recall what they were?
Bound rule's one of them. That's huge.
I'm sorry?
I said the bound rule. Catching a ball on the hop, that's huge.
Right. Oh, yeah. Was it a pitching thing too?
Yeah, the fly game versus the and the fly game. How was it sold?
It was manly.
Or more manly, yeah. Macho.
Manly, absolutely.
It was more manly. So
more ladies want to see that.
If you're able to play the fly rule. And what was the other thing that began to change?
Are you talking about like balls and strikes or the
Yeah.
codifying of the strike zone?
That's it. The balls and strikes. The idea that you couldn't just expect a guy to get up there and pitch, 150 pitches in an inning, and just the batter just standing there and saying, "I don't like any of them." So they finally. Now, usually umpires did not begin to call balls and strikes until they became like kind of problematic in delaying the game and so forth and so on, and then they would resort to it. They didn't call anything that was close. It had to really be like if it's a strike. It had to really be over the plate. But they weren't into so much the nuances of today. So by the end of the Civil War, how many ball games are there? Really?
16.
One. There's only baseball. What happened to cricket?
It was an English game.
Cricket never recovers. By the time the Civil War ends, cricket is really something that's almost a novelty, where it had been the predominant game of ball before baseball in New York and in some places. Probably Philadelphia is where it has lasted the longest as a kind of a lot of people participating in it. But by the end of the Civil War, cricket is almost non-existent. And it has a lot to do with, us thinking that baseball is the American game. Cricket is something now foreign. So let's talk about a minute. Let's start at 1865. But this has actually been going on since 1861, 60. What is the strategy, or first of all, what's the criteria to be the champion team? What's the criteria?
You got to beat
winning 2 games.
You can't be defeated twice. You have to have the championship, number one. You have to be the champion already. So if it's 1865, it means that, let's say the beginning of the 1865 season, you have to have been the champion of 1864. You have to come off 1864 as the champion. And you come around to 1865 now, and the criteria, as Jerry points out, is that it is 2 games. You cannot lose 2 games to the opposition. In a 3-game series, if you lose 2 games, the team you lose to is the champion. So what becomes the strategy of 1860s baseball?
Don't play anybody twice.
Yeah.
Delay.
Thinking about that from our perspective now, it's really hard to fathom how you could come up with that as a way of deciding a championship. I mean, it just, from our perspective, 150 years later, it doesn't make any sense at all. But I guess it contributes to the parochialism, because if you can get it for your city, and then you can avoid playing anybody for a long time, you can keep it in the city for more than a year.
Isn't that why
there was no central organization. Nobody made a schedule. So the only way to make a game, you had to contact the other team, say, can you come on over here on Tuesday?
Well, the interesting thing, as that Bill points out, is there is an organization. It's the National Association of Baseball Players.
But they only dealt with rules, right?
I'm sorry?
They only dealt with rules and discipline.
They have a judiciary committee that is supposed to be their disciplinary arm. What does the judicial committee do for most of the 1860s.
Like the House, like the Republican House right now. Doesn't do anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, they're more or less like the Republican House right now. In fact, when you read this, you kind of, you kind of like, in a way, you kind of think a little bit about that as you're reading it today. It's an absolute crazy situation. And I remember when I read this book initially, which is probably close to 20 years ago, when I read this book initially, I remember thinking, wow, this is insane, you know? And as I'm reading it again, I'm saying, wow, this is insane. Most of the seasons, there's no real even attempt to play anybody that only around August, when they get that deep into the season, did they actually begin now to kind of maneuver and to try to think about becoming the champion, or more importantly, how to remain champion.
Yeah.
And how to remain champion is what Terry said, is really to dodge playing the other team at you know, at all possible. So you see all these wacky excuses of you know, what's happening here. At this time, Bill takes a real talks a little bit about this you know, dodging and weaving to present you know, to prevent a challenge to their championship. And the masters of this, what team do you think are the masters of this strategy?
Mutuals?
The Athletics.
No, not the Athletics.
Mutual.
The Atlantics. Not the
The
Atlantics.
Atlantics.
Oh, the Atlantic.
Wrong A word.
Yeah, the Atlantics of Brooklyn are the absolute masters of dodging, playing, particularly the Athletics, because they perceive the Athletics as a real challenge to them. So they do everything in their power to keep from playing them, and doing so successfully some years. You know, most years. Bill does take a little detour here in chapter 8, where he talks about Wansley and McKeever. I hadn't remembered this at all, but then it kind of came back to me a bit. Does anybody know who Wansley and McKeever were?
Those two guys who gambled.
Yeah,
The
players.
The players,
Yeah.
The two players
Arranged.
who cheated.
They're two guys that were. What team did they play for?
Oh,
Mutuals?
The Mutuals.
Mutuals,
Yeah. Yeah, they play for the Mutuals. And, you know, again, you know, you're looking at, of course, you know, he tells the story of Wansley and McKeever. They are guys. Wansley is very kind of obviously throwing a game where he allows like 6 pass balls, makes 4 wild throws. He goes over 4, you know, over 5. And then it's corroborated by like another young guy in the team who corroborates, yes, the game was going to be fixed, and we knew it, and Wansley fixed it. McKeever is also he's a younger fellow, but he's also a heavy gambler. But he's into particularly gambling on trotters, and he follows the horses, and he ends up going to with one of his horses. He ends up going to Chicago to put this particular horse in a race, and he strongly suspects, after the original driver in the race, who ends up losing right away, he ends up that this guy's on the take, and he then goes and this McKeever decides that he's going to drive himself. And as soon as he drives himself, he wins 3 races consecutively. And by the time he's about to run the 3rd race, a couple of Chicago brothers who own a saloon actually put a board across the track. It's dark out by this time. And they put a board across the track, and McKeever is killed. He's actually murdered by these 2 guys. But what really happens here is it speaks very much about who the Mutuals have on their team and what kind of a team the Mutuals are. Who's affiliated with the Mutuals, by the way?
Isn't it Tammany Hall?
Tammany Hall.
Yeah. Yeah, Boss
Tammany
Tweed.
Hall. Tammany Hall, and none other than
Boss Tweed.
none other than
Yeah.
Boss Tweed. So there's a little bit of a reputation there, and Bill gets into that a little bit. Talk about that. By the end of the 65 season, this is the first full season after the Civil War. You had 91 clubs show up to join the National Association of Baseball Players, and naturally, you're getting more and more clubs that are outside of New York City proper, or New York, Brooklyn. Of course, you got the Athletics and a few other teams up in Boston and so forth. One team comes from not far from Newark, New Jersey, but they're where in New Jersey they come from?
Irvington.
Yeah.
Your old stomping ground, Bob.
Father's area.
And the Irvingtons are considered a country team. And what do they mean by a country team?
5 miles out of town.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're kind of like, they're like not really the tough guys from New York or Philly, kind of, they're supposed to be pushovers. The only thing about the Irvingtons, it turns out they're not pushovers, and they defeat the Atlantics of all teams. And they got some really tough fans who are they're really gamblers, their fans, and their fans are following them around. And they got big money running on their games. So the Irvingtons are a kind of a team that everybody thinks is a country team, but is not a country team. Now let's talk about that riot in Philadelphia. Does anybody know what initiated the riot? So as I was saying, they end up with a kind of flimsy fence and all of this stuff around the field that they've been playing in. It's an enclosed field, but it's not, too rigid and not too stable. And 40,000 people show up to see the Atlantics and Philadelphia play. Now, of course, the Atlantics are the champions, and everybody is anxiously awaiting that the Athletics now have their shot to overtake the Atlantics, in this game, keep it away from the Atlantics. And so 40,000 people show up to this game. Does the field fit 40,000? Not even close. What ends up happening is a fight breaks out between two guys. Must be an Eagles game. No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that. The fight breaks out in Philadelphia between two guys, and the next thing you know, even the fence gets knocked down. There's 40,000 people in the area, some a quarter mile away, and they're completely overwhelmed. So the Athletics are willing to do anything to get a shot at that title of the championship with the Atlantics. So what do you think they do? Joanne, I can't hear you. I know you're saying something.
They canceled the game.
No, they what?
They canceled the game?
No, the Atlantics now are going to, they have to cancel the game because there's this riot. There was 40,000 people riot. Right, they do cancel the game. Yeah. But
beyond
the Athletics are so desperate to get a shot back, and they're in Philadelphia, and their field has been destroyed. So what do you think they do?
They agree to go to Brooklyn?
No, well, they go to Brooklyn. They play in Brooklyn, but they still have to win that second game in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Okay. So what they do is they spend a lot of money to rebuild their field.
Oh, no, really?
So they have a situation here where it's a 1-1, a 1-1 tie, and they're going to play this third game on this rebuilt field. They spent a lot of money rebuilding it. And they also bring in all kinds of reinforcements in terms of police presence. I think 200 police, 200 police is in the Capitol grounds later. But they bring in a big contingent of police officers, and they play the game, and the Atlantics win it, and they're supposed to split the gate. But what do you think the Athletics do?
They deducted the cost of the new stadium from there.
So the Athletics say, look at all the money we spent on this fence. We'll split the gate with you, but we have to recover our money on the fence. So what happens is it becomes a dispute. And when it becomes a dispute, the Atlantics quickly claim the game to be a forfeiture so that they can retain the championship. So these are the things that do happen. Again, Bill takes a little segue to talk about separate but unequal. And he talks about the condition after the Civil War of African Americans playing a game of baseball. And he talks about in 1866 the formation of the KKK in Tennessee and all of the implications of that. He talks about there being two black teams that were kind of widely known, the Bachelors of Albany, New York, and the Monitors of Jamaica, Long Island, New York, as the two prominent black teams. Of course, we know now, something probably that Bill did not know then, there were the Weeksville and Unknowns that played, two black teams that played in the 1859 in Brooklyn. There is a game that's played between two black teams, the Excelsiors of Philadelphia and the Uniques of Brooklyn. And what happened was it became a game that was taken over by a kind of media. It was taken over by an article written about the game, but whoever wrote the article wrote it in a way that really diminished the players, the black players, to kind of almost a comic type game. And that particular article went a long way. And as you see a lot of these sketches later in the 19th century of black baseball being something of a humorous thing and, so forth and so on. And that kind of tainted black play. Of course, what he does also talk about is the Pythians. At the time, he called it the first game. We know today that wasn't exactly the first interracial game, but it was certainly at its time, it was the most well-known interracial game because it did get wide publicity. It was in a major city in Philadelphia. And he talks about that, and he talks about how they were shunned admission to the state association, and then later on the NA National Association. We're rolling along. We get to 1867, and the Atlantics are now again the champions of the 1867 season. And people are beginning to, member teams and member individuals are beginning to talk about out loud about how the system should be reformed. So what do you think some of their ideas are?
You have different class of teams, the pro teams and amateur teams.
Amateurs, yeah.
Right. First of all, they They say that championship should only be, although there's supposed to be no professionalism, they say that championship should only be between top teams, which meant professional teams, teams with somebody who's being reimbursed, or at least where teams are like somehow garnering portions of the admission.
Also, something
they
about
also came up with the idea of, well, maybe it should be winning percentage, or maybe it should be winning percentage only if it is considering only teams that are the professionals. In other words, amateur games don't count. If they go and play some little hokey-doke team that's an amateur team and win, that doesn't go towards their percentage. And these are all of the ideas, or some of the ideas, that are being put forward to kind of reform this this system of these two losses as a champion. So what? How many of those ideas are implemented? None. Joey had it. It was none. That was exactly what happened. The 1867 season, with all this discussion about reform and all of these ideas put forward to make it a more, fairer play and so forth, went nowhere. But 1867 is known for one other thing that is very, very important, and it involves a team that takes a road trip. Does anybody remember or recall what team that might be, and what road trip did they take?
The Nationals headed out west, ending up in Chicago.
Yeah.
Right. The Nationals of Washington, D.C. travel out to Chicago, and they schedule, I think it's 10 games en route. They're going to start, the first game is in Cleveland, and then they're going to go on, and they're going to move. So this is the very first time that a team is going to go that far west to play. And really, it was a big deal at its time. So that tour took 3 weeks to get to, 3 weeks and stopping and playing those 10 games. How did they manage that, the players?
They were, a lot of them were government, employees that, or maybe later on they came, but they were under the payroll of the government.
Right.
And so they were given the time off and they were given the money, but they didn't really work during that time period during the summer baseball season.
And by the way, it wasn't just the players. There was a total of 40 people that were on that tour, and they were all from the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and the players were on their vacations, and they just went out to Chicago to play those 10 games. One very interesting thing happened. They lost one game. They lost only one game. They really dazzled everybody out there. Who did they lose to?
The Rockford team.
Rockford.
They lost to the Rockford team. And who pitched that game?
Spalding.
For Rockford?
Spalding,
right. So, a very, very interesting game. Of course, the Nationals then, the Chicagos couldn't believe that, a little team like Rockford would defeat them, and there was all kinds of accusations that the game was thrown, so it would change the odds in the game in Chicago. But that was the only game the Nationals lost. The interesting thing was, it was such a big deal for its time, and by 1867, when that tour was completed, baseball was truly being called the
national
game.
Yeah, national pastime. Because it was now this, figuring they're going that far out, they really done something national. It's interesting too that at the time the Nationals were really at the top of their game. They never ever recovered that. They just slowly just kind of sank into the background. But at the time that they completed that tour, they were the cats meow.
Maybe they lost their jobs.
I'm sorry?
Maybe they lost their jobs. They couldn't play anymore.
Maybe they lost George Wright.
So the following year, or during 1867, during the same year, there's a little change happening in New York. And does anybody know what that change is? That another team comes along into the action, and is all of a sudden a hard team to beat. They're the Unions of Morrisania, and they're a team that's been playing in very southern Westchester, just above the Bronx, and they're have been there and have been in competition and have had successful players and some players of some renown. But suddenly in 1867, they really are vying for the championship, and they beat the Atlantics, who are the reigning champs, for the first time ever. It was the first time that Morrisania had ever beaten the Atlantics that season. And, of course, what finally begins to happen is that the Atlantics are now have lost a game or two games to another team, and they're not the champions when Morrisania beats them. But the team that they lost the championship. So who was the 1867 champion? Is the Atlantics again. So they emerge in this game of dodging, playing that second game. So I just like to read to you. This is on page. I'm sorry. This is on page 135. One paragraph that kind of sums up what has been going on here. Thus the association lumbered on, probing, attempting by trial and error to find a structure and operating methods that could manage this out of control monster. The ruling body always seemed to find itself a step behind, chasing a membership that essentially ran by itself, viewing the association only as the reason for a pleasant, harmonious, and optimistic annual convention. For the rest of the year, members were merely wished for the governing organization to allow their club to operate in its own best interests. From all outward appearances, the association was very happy to cooperate, sitting idly by as the regulations were flaunted on a regular basis. So that paragraph, I think, kind of sums up what has been going on through almost the entire decade. All right, I'm looking nice to move on here very quickly. I'm going to jump all the way up to 1868. There's a team that starts to play in a western city called Cincinnati. And that team, of course, is the Red Stockings. Also that same year, Frank Queen, who owns the New York Clipper, decides that he should up the ante a little bit for a championship at least, and offer a gold ball instead of a silver ball. So 1868 is going to be a year that the championship is going to be, the champion is going to be awarded a gold ball. When he gets to the end of that season, he's so disgusted that he can't offer the gold ball to any team because they're playing this game of keep away, and he gets kind of frustrated by it. He knows that the team to beat is rapidly approaching and coming from the West, and that is who?
Red Stockings.
Red Stockings. And in 1869, Bill talks about, what's happening out there, and Harry Wright and that team going on the road. Cincinnati is chosen because it is an up-and-coming city, and it started as a small little settlement, and by 1840 or so, it has something like 20 flour mills. Becomes the biggest processor of pork in the country, and is nicknamed Porkopolis, sometimes also called the Queen City, which I think they preferred. Who is Aaron Champion? Does anybody know?
The club owner or
president? Yeah, he's the president of the Cincinnati Baseball Club. And he is the guy who comes up with this idea of having this club and getting Harry Wright to come to Cincinnati. At first to manage a cricket club, but then quickly switches him over to baseball, and they become the predominant occupant of the Cincinnati baseball grounds, which is actually a really first-class baseball field. And there's another fella that is the secretary of that committee that runs the team, and that is a guy by the name of John Joyce. And at the time, John Joyce is a very nondescript figure. He's somebody that's, just thought to be a secretary, a guy that kind of understood finances and things like that. But that's all he was thought to be. So, of course, in 1869, they tie only one game. So they go undefeated, and everybody kind of knows that story about 19th century baseball. That's called the glorious season. The following, and the gold ball is still up in the air, and it finally goes to the Atlantics again for the 1869 season. In 1870, the Red Stockings come into their second year, and they begin the season again, like a steamroller. And they come in to play the Atlantics in Brooklyn in June, I think it's June 14th, 1870. And what happens there?
They lose?
They lose. They finally lose. It's the first game that they lose in this very long stretch that begins all the way back in 1869. By the way, that first game was played in 1869. It was actually played in San Francisco. They became the first team to ever cross the continent, and they did it on the newly completed Intercontinental Railway. So in 1870, they lose. And the title is, when they lose, beaten but not disgraced. So who said that? He said it by telegram.
Champion?
Champion was in Brooklyn to see that game against the Atlantics. And it's the game that they go into extra innings. In the 11th inning, the game was won by the Atlantics. A little controversial. What the heck? I mean, so a kid runs out of the field and jumps on the outfielder's back, I mean, you're in Brooklyn. So Joanne knows all about that because she actually was there at that game. And she commented on it at the time. Actually, Bill Ryczek also created, and with Joanne and John Thorne and another fellow, they created an audio replication of that game as if it was a broadcast. Actually, it was a video, right? Or no, an audio.
Audio, yeah.
So Champion, he goes back and he says, we're beaten but not disgraced. And all seems well. And how much money did the Red Stockings make on that season?
$1 and change. Like $1 and change, right?
Well, I mean, that's what they say. But they actually came back with $7,200. At the end of the season, when all was said and done, they were $7,200 in the black.
Right.
And a lot of people don't, you know, Bill points this out in, you know, in the book. You know, there was when everything was said and done, and they added up everything that they took in and all their season-long, you know, expenses, they came up with $7,200 in the black. There's one other team, by the way, I want to mention that Bill brings into the picture here. It's called the $18,000 Nine. Who were they?
Chicago.
That's right. Jack, I knew you'd know that. Chicago is beginning to now think that, hey, let's not fool around any longer. Let's put up the money and let's buy a great team. What they did was they bought great players, but they never really had a team, not like Cincinnati did. And anyway, so they did okay, but they didn't do what they thought they would do. So 1870 becomes another squabble, of course, involving the Atlantics again, and so forth and so on. And finally, at the 1870 winter meeting, it's now the decade is over. 1870 winter meeting, at that meeting, there was actually a vote taken, and they decide to divide teams into professionals and amateurs. And the vote was really controlled largely by New York and Pennsylvania because they had the most delegate votes. And by that time, they had switched to a delegate system. And they end up at that winter meeting voting on that. So that meeting takes place at the Grand Central Hotel in New York City. And a couple of things happen to sum it up. The the Excelsiors. First of all, the Knickerbockers at the beginning of near the end of that season of 1870, Knickerbockers announced that they no longer want to be a member of the National Association of Baseball Players because they feel that the game has just gone in a direction of, you know, money and not social, and they want nothing to do with it anymore. So the Knickerbockers retreat. So the last convention is in the hotel. There's 221 clubs there that are represented, and they have this election. And then on December 13, the Excelsiors call for the formation of a new amateur league association. So they still want there to be an amateur association, and they call for that. And on March the 16th of 1871, they call for this amateur association, and they lead the amateur movement. The next day, on March 17th, 1871, what happens on 3rd Avenue and near 14th Street, 13th to 14th Street, 3rd Avenue, the confines of the 9th Precinct? What happens?
National Association?
National Association meets. And those are the guys. Do you have $10? You could join our association and be a professional. So I just want to read these last couple of sentences. A mere 6 years later, he's talking from 1865, hundreds of teams stretch from Maine to New Orleans to San Francisco. The occasional covert semi-professionalism of 1865 had 100 brethren by 1871. So what was a handful of professional players in 1865 became 100 by 1871. Baseball was no longer an avocation. In 6 years, it had become an institution. The uncertainties of the 1865 had resolved in resounding fashion. Baseball was here to stay. So that's how Bill ends when Johnny came sliding home. And I apologize for going on. Moderating is tough, Jack.
Oh, yeah.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Peter.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks
Let
a
me
great
just
deal.
thank you, Peter, and lots of interesting thing in the material in that book. The next session we have is on November 8th at 8 p.m. Jack Bales will lead a discussion of the Beer and Whiskey League by David Nemec.
And by the way, Jack is much better at this than I am.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, y'all have a good night. Let's see how the Phillies and the Diamondbacks do.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Good night. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.
I loved
Thank
it.
you.
Peter, that was
Bye-bye.
great.